Auto insurance can all seem the same until it comes time to use it. So don't get stuck paying more for less coverage. Switch to USAA Auto Insurance and you could start saving money in no time. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
Hi everybody and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. Today I'm going to be talking about when you're upset because your spouse does not weight the data that is more recent in your behavior than older data, particularly if you have undergone some dramatic behavioral shift from your perspective. You've changed a lot, but they continue to think that the old behavior prior to your change in perception should be weighted equally to the more recent data. And there is a little math analogy or computer science analogy I have that I was taught by a client, for those of you who are inclined to think that way. Before we get to that, I want to tell you to subscribe. The most recent subscriber episode was on when you do not realize your parents were dysfunctional until long after you reach adulthood, and how perceiving your family as more healthy than they really were can really screw you up in terms of later relationships, because you're emulating people that, when you think about it, you really shouldn't be emulating as much as you may love them. All right, so moving on to this topic. So a lot of times when people have changed, so for example, let's talk about anger. That's like a common one. So let's say that somebody was angry for many years, and it was a symptom of depression, or it was what they modeled from their parents growing up, or they just didn't really think about it as abnormal. And then eventually they realized that their anger was a problem, and they started therapy, or they started meditating, or they went on an antidepressant, whatever, and they've really stopped reacting with yelling and anger. But then when we're in couples counseling, or for people who aren't in couples counseling, when they're just talking, the spouse always brings up the times that they had been angry and scary, even though those are years ago and the person has changed since then and really has not had an episode like that in a while. So a client told me about the sliding window method in computer science, where there's ways to weight the data such that the older data is weighted less than the more recent data. And that is thought to give a more accurate perspective and picture of the data. And I thought that, this was a good analogy for other people as well, that they could understand why this isn't exactly fair to be blaming a spouse as much for previous data from a long time ago, from before a behavior change, as recent data, right? And it is a good analogy, and it makes you understand why this is not accurate, because it really isn't. It shouldn't be, rather. So the way that, your husband acted 10 years ago, even if it was terrible, and maybe you'll say, well, why should I forgive that asshole behavior? I'm not talking about forgiving. I'm talking about when you, and we'll talk about that in a bit, because that deals with empathic rupture resolution, which is its own topic, and I have podcasts about empathic ruptures. But if you are trying to say to a spouse, here is why I do not trust you, because at any moment in the future you can do X, then the spouse really gets mad if X is something that they've been working on. The spouse is like, listen, X was how I acted before I changed. In recent years, you don't have any proof that I'm going to act this way again. So if you're trying to predict my behavior coming up based on data, please use my most recent data and weight that more heavily in this equation, right? And that makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, people are not always rational actors, and in fact are never really rational actors, particularly if they're people who think they're really rational actors. Then they're just really kind of, minimizing the impact of their emotion, and they have even less objectivity and awareness of how emotions are impacting them. So the reality is there needs to be a compromise between both people, and they both need to be understanding one another's perspective. So yes, you can definitely understand objectively the perspective of somebody who has tried to change and would now like recent data to be weighted more heavily in your predictions of what they are going to do next. You can understand that. I think I've explained it pretty well. Despite not being a math person, this is a fairly intuitive concept, right? However, the other person, the person who is mad that they are being predicted to act like an asshole in the future based on, distal data, right? That person needs to understand that empathic ruptures are real, and the person is not thinking like a computer. They have been traumatized by actions in the past, and you can't really apply some sort of numerical, equation to this, because the reality is there are certain things that the person is viewing as a trauma, and they are coded in a different part of the brain reserved for trauma. Basically, in trauma work, what we do is we try to get the trauma memory to be encoded really in a different part of the brain, in the frontal lobe, as part of a objective narrative of the person's life. When in reality, trauma memories are coded in a different place. That's why they frequently come out as nightmares and as flashbacks, and they're more visual, and people need to process and resolve these traumatic empathic ruptures in order to move forward and then to be cleared to see things more objectively. So if a woman never gets to really process, let's say, the time that the man threw something at her out of anger and she felt scared for her life, if she can never process that and grieve it, and he doesn't really own it, and he apologizes briefly because he's so ashamed, but he doesn't really sit there with her feelings about it, then how can she be expected to just move forward like a computer and say, okay, well, he hasn't really done anything like that for 5 years now? Yeah, okay, she can say it. And if she's staying, that information is probably the reason that she's staying. But it doesn't mean that when she looks at him, some part of her brain doesn't light up with a fear signal, right? And that she doesn't still view him as potentially dangerous, because those trauma memories have been encoded in a different part of the brain, and she views him as dangerous and unsafe. So we got to get to a place where both people can understand the other person's perspective. Men especially always come up with these smart analogies that are very objective and that involve economics, or in this way computer science or math or whatever. And I like these analogies. They help me speak to other males. But the point is that women are always like, yeah, but I don't work like that. Like, that isn't really how I think, because I still am scared because of these same things. And quite honestly, you've never really empathized with me or validated my experience when you did used to act this way. And that's really the key to moving forward. So the key to moving forward, on one hand, yes, you got to amass more data points of you acting in the healthy way, sure. And only time can do that, though. Like, you can't get all of those interactions into 10 minutes, and they compensate for 10 years of dysfunction. So you got to have another few years in front of you, right? But it's like with repair after infidelity. You can't be like, hey, shit, I've been faithful since Tuesday. Why is this bitch still complaining? I mean, it's like, what? What are you talking about? Time. Time is going to heal. You have to be shown over time to be faithful, But also, there needs to be, and you could go back to my podcast on empathic ruptures and how to resolve, but there needs to be a lot of understanding that the person is not a robot, and they need you to deeply understand and validate and empathize with how scared they were, or how upset they were, or how betrayed they were. And if you haven't done your own work internally in therapy, and your ego is still pretty fragile and you can't handle anything perceived as negative feedback or criticism, you're not going to be good at this. You're going to get defensive, and you're going to get ashamed, and you're going to shut them down and say that was then and this is now. And then they aren't going to do any weighting of any data because they hate you, And so what you need to do is understand that if you want your spouse to really perceive you as a changed person, a primary way that you can show that you're a changed person is by being non-defensive and going back and listening truly to how they felt at the the time that you behaved in the unhealthy ways that you did, and really sitting there as long as it needs for them to tell you the story and saying, I am so sorry. I have never really pictured it from your perspective. It sounds terrible. I would feel the same as you do if I were you in that situation. And I completely understand why you don't trust me. And for the people who can say things like that sincerely, it's a game changer. That validation and empathy does 1,000 times more than any number of iterations of better behavior in the in the lifespan of your marriage. So you could have behaved bad, let's say, 3 times, and then behaved good 3,000 times. But if those 3 times involved something super traumatic, then you really still have to own it. You have to own it. These all things that you do in a marriage, and I'm sure this is no big epiphany, all things you do are not of equal valence, I mean, it's like my constant example of empathic ruptures is when the man leaves after the baby was born to go get his sleep back at home, and she's shocked and feels alone and abandoned and can barely verbalize it because she's sitting there right after giving birth, and then he leaves, he goes home, he gets a night's sleep, he comes back, and it's never the same, right? And so he could say, but I've missed so much sleep for her. I've been the one to pick up the kids at their late events now, and I do all of this. I take red-eye flights back from California from work because I don't want to leave her alone with the kids for too long. I have sacrificed sleep time after time after time. Yeah, but all those times weren't the birth of a child, So you could say, why are we why is our algorithm messed up and we're weighting, long ago data more than recent data? And you have a point, but you also probably have not ever really been there to empathize and validate and resolve the key rupture that made that data point so important to her. Because it wasn't just another night of sleep to her, and there's no other ways to really make up for it unless you truly understand and help her process and grieve what happened. And I'm saying her. The genders can be inverted, but the reality, the truth of the matter is that women tend to want more deep verbal processing and empathizing of past ruptures. Men truly do believe more in the sliding window algorithm. And if a woman said, you know what, we had a celibate couple of years, but I'm DTF every night from now on, you remember DTF from the Jersey Shore, down to F. But if the man would say, thank God, great, awesome, let's get into the bedroom. Women, it's not the same way. So as I say frequently to people who struggle with how one gender usually interacts, I say, listen, do you want to stay heterosexual? Yes. All right, good. Then this is what we got to deal with. So if there was an empathic rupture with your wife in which you really understand that you kind of behaved like a shit, then you should say, listen, I know I've been trying to show you that I'm different now, but maybe I never really listened and apologized deeply and validated the experience. And maybe if we talk about it again and you really hear that I'm sorry, it will help. Tell it to me. Women will fall down. They really will be fall down of shock to have you say, I would like to hear again about how I hurt you. And this is why it's such a game changer, because it shows such a paradigm shift. Instead of being defensive, you're actually saying, let's talk about it. Let's actually talk about the time that I went home. How did you feel? I'm trying to get there. I'm trying to really understand why this is so bad for you. And honestly, you probably will after she explains it. And that will be weighted more than even the recent data. If you can truly resolve that empathic rupture, which is something that couples counseling can help with. If you're like, man, I ain't no expert. I'm not going into the lion's den. What do I look like, a Roman gladiator to you? I will never survive that. Well, then you should be going into couples counseling where you have somebody who can go through the empathic ruptures with you and help you. And at that point, if the woman sees that you really, really are trying to deeply understand and resolve these past hurts, she will I believe, and I've seen it happen, start weighting your more recent data a hell of a lot more, just as she's supposed to. Because then she will not have anything in her mind that's saying, if you move on, that he will never, ever understand how you felt at that time of trauma. And that is a subconscious desire that a lot of people have. And you could frame it as punishing or the person, or you could frame it as a totally normal way that people don't want to get hurt again by something that, again, in their mind has an unusually high weight. You know, the coefficient is way high, even if it was 10 years ago. It's a coefficient of 1,000,000 versus yesterday, whatever you did right is a coefficient of 0.1, you know, and so I can just mess up math all over, but you see my point, hopefully. All right, so hopefully you found this useful. I really do think that if you at all think that there has been an unresolved empathic rupture, that you should bring it up to your spouse and be like, maybe I have not been fair. I have thought that people are very rational, linear thinkers, and I have not understood the role of brain processing and emotion processing and the encoding, the differential encoding of traumatic memories in the brain. Really. You could read The Body Keeps the Score. That would be a good thing to read. It's a classic by Bessel van der Kolk. The Body Keeps the Score. It's about trauma. So it can help you understand a lot of how trauma is encoded differently. And you may be like, trauma? There's people who go through combat. I went home to go to sleep. Yeah, big shit. If that's still how you're thinking, not only do you need to read Bessel van der Kolk, but you probably need to be in therapy, because there's something called subjectivity. And when people think that there isn't is when they seem truly like, you know, robots. And no woman wants to be close to a robot, except there was a movie I saw, but I can't do spoiler. It was a perfect male robot. But anyway, this is beyond a tangent. So I'll talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.